Hello dear students, my name is Shaina Gupta and I am an assistant professor in RPIIT Medical and Technical Campus. Today we will understand about foreign exchange exposure. What is foreign exchange exposure? The meaning of the foreign exchange exposure is defined as the degree to which the company is affected by exchange rate change. Foreign exchange exposure occurs because of the unanticipated change in the exchange. So, if we want to explain it, the foreign exchange exposure refers to a risk that is associated with the foreign exchange rates that changes frequently and can have an adverse effect on the financial transactions denominated in some foreign currencies rather than the domestic currency of the country. In other words, the firm's risk that its future cash flow will get affected by the change in the value of the foreign currency in which it has maintained its books of accounts due to the volatility of the foreign exchange rate is termed as the foreign exchange exposure. Then comes types and methods of foreign exchange exposure. There are basically three types of foreign exchange exposures: transaction exposure, operating exposure, and translation exposure. Let's start with the translation exposure. Now, translation exposure is also known as the accounting exposure. The risk arising out of the conversion or the translation of the statement of a subsidiary company into parent company leads to this type of exposure. And translation exposure occurs whenever an asset or a liability is valued in a foreign currency. So if we want to define the translation exposure, or we can say the accounting exposure, then it is the risk of the loss that the company will suffer when the stock, revenue, assets and liabilities are dominated in the foreign currency, are changed with the changes with the movement in the foreign exchange rates. Or in other words, we can say the translation exposure stems from the requirement of converting the subsidiary assets and liabilities that are operating in the other country dominated in the foreign currency in the home currency of the parent company at the time of preparing the consolidated profit and loss statement and balance sheet. Therefore, any change in the foreign exchange rate will ultimately affect will impact on the financial statements of the country. In translating the items dominated in the foreign currency in a domestic currency, then two issues will generally arise when we record the assets and when we record the liabilities. So let's take the example of the liability translation exposure. In liability translation exposure, let's take an example. Suppose a firm has mortgaged on a real estate in a foreign country. Now the foreign currency increases in value as compared to the home currency. Real estate is physically unchanged. Real exchange hasn't changed. But the book value of the real estate's liability will increase in the home currency. And in case of the asset translation exposure, let's take an example. Now a firm is holding inventory that is valued in the foreign currency. Now the value of the foreign currency declines as compared to the currency of the home country. Now inventory is the same, the quantity is the same, but the book value of the inventory will decline in the home currency. This is the translation exposure that arises when the books of the subsidiaries are converted into the parent's country's books and are translated in the home currency. Then comes transaction exposure, that is also known as the contractual exposure. Here it measures the change in the value of the outstanding financial obligations. It arises when there is a fluctuation in the exchange rate between the time at which the contract is signed and at the time when the settlement is to be made. It will directly impact the cash flow of the firm. So here, this is kind of the exposure risk that involves the international trade, where we do the cross currency transactions, or we can say when we have a multiple currency transactions. This risk is faced by the company that is dealing in the international trade. The currency exchange rate may change before the final settlement of the contract is termed as the transaction exposure. Now, let's take an example of the transaction exposure. Suppose there is a company X and a company Y. Now, company X is exporting 1000 kgs of spices to the company Y. At the time of the contract, the price or the exchange rate was $1 equals to rupees 71.5. Now, at the end of the term, because there are the constant fluctuations in the exchange rate, now the exchange rate has risen to $1 equals to rupees 74. Now this leads to the transaction exposure. So the constant fluctuation in the exchange rate will lead to the transaction exposure. Then comes management of transaction exposure, how we can manage it. Now, since the appreciation of the foreign currency increases the value of the cash inflows or the outflows, that's why it is difficult to predict the actual movement of the foreign currencies. Even the smallest of the movement in the foreign currency can have a great impact in the profitability of the company. Now, the companies could save themselves. To save themselves, what company can do? The companies can do that they can use the hedging techniques against the transaction exposure. Businesses frequently attempts or take steps so that they can eliminate their exchange risk. For this, there are many hedging techniques that are used, like forward contract, future contracts, currency options, money market hedging. These are the basic examples that the companies use to protect themselves or to minimize the impact of the foreign exchange risk to their companies or to their profitability. Then comes, what are the key differences that are between the transaction exposure and the translation exposure? Now, the key difference between the transaction exposure and the translation exposure is that the transaction exposure impacts the cash flow of the firm, while the translation exposure has no effect on the current, or we can say on the direct cash flows. This is the basic or the key difference between the two. Now, how can you reduce transaction and the translation exposure? So, if you want to reduce the translation and the transaction exposure, what we can do? We can use a lead strategy or a lag strategy. So, now what is the lead strategy? In the lead strategy, what we do? We attempt to collect the foreign currency receivables, that are the payments from the customers, early when a foreign currency is expected to depreciate. And paying the foreign currency, that is, we have to pay to our suppliers before they are due, when the currency is expected to appreciate. Whenever we feel the currency is going to depreciate, we receive. When we feel the currency is going to appreciate, we start paying. Then comes the lag strategy. Now, under the lag strategy, what we do? Here we delay the collection of the foreign currency receivables if the currency is expected to be appreciated, and then we delay the payables if we expect the company is going to depreciate. Then comes the last or The third kind of exposure, that is economic exposure, that is also known as the operating exposure. Now, what is the economic exposure? Economic exposure is a type of foreign exchange exposure that is caused by the when there is an unexpected currency fluctuation on the company's future cash flows, investment or earnings. Now here economic exposure refers to the extent to which the firm's cash flow will get affected due to the change in the foreign exchange rate along with the price change. Here the risk that firm's revenue will be adversely affected due to the substantial change in the exchange rate and the inflation rate, then it is called the economic exposure or a operating exposure. Now, what are the techniques that we can use to reduce the economic exposure? First, a company can reduce its manufacturing cost by taking its production facilities to the low cost countries. Here we can do what we can do. We can start to reduce our manufacturing cost. We can set up our plant in those countries where the cost of production will be low. Second, the company can outsource its products or can apply the low labor cost. Then the company can diversify its product and services and can sell them to the clients all over the world. Now, fourth, a company can continually invest in the research and development. Subsequently, it can offer innovative products and higher prices, and then company can use the derivatives and hedgings against the exchange rate changes so that they can reduce the impact of the economic exposure. Then comes the basic difference on basis of the different bases. First, on the basis of duration, if we see, economic exposure is for the life of the project. Transaction exposure will be during the duration of the contract, and translation will be at the point of the time when we do the conversion. Gains and losses, on the basis of gains and losses, economic exposure will give us the actual total value that is difficult to compute. Here the transaction exposure will be actual, total value will be relatively less difficult to calculate, and translation exposure, paper exercise only, very easy to work out. Contract, very general in nature, transaction specific in nature, and translation exposure specific in nature. In case of measurement, economic exposure's value depends on the variation in actual spot rates. Translation exposure's value depends on the change in actual spot rate, and translation exposure value depends on the accounting guidelines. And last, on the case of hedging, economic exposure very difficult because it is very difficult to predict. Transaction relatively easy, and translation exposure is very easy to create a hedge against. That's all in the foreign exchange exposure. I hope the concept is clear to you. For similar kind of videos, please keep watching RPIIT Academics channel. That's all for today. Have a good day. Thank you.